The conference room at Pinnacle Marketing Solutions buzzed with nervous energy as 23 employees sat around the polished mahogany table, waiting for the announcement that would change everything. Victoria Hartwell adjusted her designer blazer and smoothed her perfectly styled blonde hair, confident that after 3 years as senior marketing director, she was finally about to be promoted to vice president. She had been dropping hints to everyone, including her boyfriend's family, about the big changes coming her way. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Ladies and gentlemen, announced CEO Richard Manning as he stood at the head of the table, I'd like you to meet the new owner of Pinnacle Marketing Solutions. The door opened, and I walked in wearing a simple black dress and carrying the same leather portfolio I'd carried every day for the past 8 months as the company's executive assistant. Victoria's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and then pure shock as the reality hit her. This was the same woman she had dismissed just 3 days earlier at her boyfriend's family barbecue as just a secretary who wouldn't understand business conversations. The same woman she had patronizingly suggested should fetch drinks while the adults talked about important matters. The same woman who was now her boss. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This story really begins 6 months earlier, on a humid Tuesday morning in downtown Phoenix. When I first walked through the glass doors of Pinnacle Marketing Solutions, carrying nothing but a carefully crafted resume and a plan that would either make me millions or cost me everything I had worked for. My name is Melody Chen, and at 28 years old, I had already built and sold 2 successful tech startups before most people my age had figured out their career paths. But success in the business world, I had learned, often came with a price that I wasn't willing to pay anymore. The constant networking events, the pressure to maintain appearances, the expectation that every conversation had to be about market share and quarterly projections, it had all begun to feel hollow and exhausting. When my second company, a data analytics platform called Streamline Core, was acquired by a Fortune 500 corporation for $48 million, I found myself with more money than I knew what to do with, and a growing desire to understand business from a completely different perspective. I had always been the boss, the decision maker, the person everyone looked to for answers. But I realized I had never truly understood what it was like to be on the other side of corporate hierarchies. That's when I developed what my business mentor, Sarah Goldstein, called the most expensive sociology experiment in corporate America. I decided to go undercover in the business world, taking entry-level positions in companies I was secretly planning to acquire, learning about workplace dynamics from the bottom up while identifying businesses with untapped potential. Pinnacle Marketing Solutions caught my attention not because it was particularly successful, but because it was failing in ways that could be easily fixed with the right leadership and investment. The company had been founded 12 years earlier by Robert Chen, no relation to me despite the shared surname, who had built a solid reputation in the Phoenix marketing scene before his health began declining. Robert was looking to sell, but he wanted to ensure the company would be preserved rather than dismantled by corporate raiders. The perfect scenario for someone who wanted to learn about business culture while making a strategic investment. I applied for the position of executive assistant under my legal name, Melody Chen, but with a completely fabricated work history that portrayed me as a recent college graduate with administrative experience but no business education. The resume was technically truthful. I did graduate from Stanford with a degree in business administration, but it conveniently omitted the 2 master's degrees, the successful startups, and the fact that I had been featured on the cover of Entrepreneur magazine just 18 months earlier. My first day at Pinnacle was a revelation in ways I hadn't expected. Walking into the office in a conservative business dress instead of my usual designer suits felt like putting on a costume, but it was liberating to know that no one had any expectations of me beyond answering phones and scheduling meetings. The office itself was a study in early 2000s corporate design that hadn't been updated since the company's founding. Beige walls, fluorescent lighting, and cubicles arranged in a way that maximized space efficiency while minimizing human interaction. The break room still had a coffee maker that looked like it had survived the Clinton administration, and the conference room featured motivational posters that unironically encouraged thinking outside the box. But what struck me most was how the employees interacted with each other. There was a clear hierarchy that went beyond official titles, a social structure based on assumptions about education, background, and potential. As the executive assistant, I was immediately categorized as support staff, someone who was pleasant enough to work with, but not someone whose opinions on business matters would be valued or even solicited. My direct supervisor, Janet Rodriguez, was a kind woman in her 50s who had been with the company for 8 years. She took pride in her work and treated everyone with genuine respect, but even she operated under the assumption that my role was purely administrative, and that I wouldn't be interested in or capable of understanding the strategic decisions being made around me. "Don't worry about understanding all the marketing jargon," she told me during my second week, as she handed me a stack of reports to file. "Your job is just to make sure everything gets where it needs to go. The important thinking is done by the marketing team." It was during my third week that I first encountered Victoria Hartwell, the senior marketing director who would later become the center of the most uncomfortable family dinner of my life. Victoria was 31, impeccably dressed, and carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her place in the corporate hierarchy. She had joined Pinnacle 3 years earlier after completing her MBA at Arizona State University, and she had quickly established herself as the company's rising star. Victoria's approach to workplace relationships was fascinating to observe from my position as the supposedly invisible administrative staff. With senior leadership, she was charming and deferential, always ready with market research that supported whatever direction they wanted to take. With her peers, she was competitive but collegial, maintaining friendships that were clearly strategic but seemed genuine enough to those involved. But with support staff, Victoria revealed a different side of her personality. She wasn't cruel or obviously condescending, but she had a way of making it clear that she viewed administrative employees as fundamentally different types of people. When she needed something from me, she would speak slowly and use simple language, as if she was concerned I might not understand basic business concepts. "Melody, honey," she said during my fourth week as she handed me a presentation to copy, "I need 15 copies of this, and make sure they're collated properly. This is for the Henderson Industries meeting, which is very important for our company's future. Do you understand what collated means?" I nodded and assured her that I understood, while mentally calculating that Henderson Industries' annual marketing budget was roughly equivalent to what I had spent on office furniture for my last startup. But Victoria's patronizing tone was actually useful information. It told me exactly how she viewed people she perceived as beneath her in the corporate hierarchy, and it gave me insight into the kind of leadership style she would likely employ if she were ever given more power. The real revelation came during my 6th week, when I accidentally became privy to a conversation that would shape my entire strategy for the company acquisition. I was delivering files to the conference room after hours when I overheard Victoria talking to Marcus Thompson, the company's financial director, about their frustrations with the current leadership structure. "Robert is a nice man, but he's completely out of touch with modern marketing," Victoria was saying, her voice carrying the kind of authority she never used when speaking to me. "We could double our revenue within 2 years if we had leadership that understood digital strategy and wasn't afraid to take risks." Marcus agreed, adding his own concerns about missed opportunities and outdated systems. But what struck me most was how they talked about the other employees, particularly the support staff and junior team members. "Half the people here don't even understand what we do," Victoria continued, "like that new assistant, Melody. Sweet girl, but you can tell she's never been exposed to real business thinking. We need to hire people who can contribute to strategy discussions, not just push papers around." I stood in the hallway, holding my stack of files and listening to someone discuss my intellectual capabilities, while having no idea that I had more business experience than everyone in that room combined. It was simultaneously hilarious and infuriating, but it also gave me valuable information about how Victoria viewed talent and potential within the organization. Over the following weeks, I began to develop a clear picture of Pinnacle's problems and opportunities. The company had excellent client relationships and a solid reputation, but it was being held back by outdated systems, risk-averse leadership, and a hierarchical culture that wasted human resources by making assumptions about people's capabilities based on their job titles. Victoria, despite her condescending attitude toward support staff, was actually quite talented at marketing strategy. Her ideas were innovative, and her understanding of client needs was sophisticated. But her leadership style was based on the belief that intelligence and business acumen were rare qualities that could be easily identified through educational credentials and job titles. It was during my 8th week that Victoria began dating my brother. I hadn't mentioned to anyone at Pinnacle that I had family in Phoenix. My brother Derek Chen was 2 years older than me and worked as a software engineer for a major tech company. Derek was brilliant with code, but had always been somewhat oblivious to social dynamics and interpersonal subtleties. He was the kind of person who could debug a complex algorithm in his sleep, but would completely miss the signs that someone was manipulating or disrespecting him. Derek met Victoria at a networking event for young professionals, and he was immediately smitten with her confidence and apparent success. When he told me about his new girlfriend during one of our weekly phone calls, describing her as a marketing director who really has her life together, I realized that my professional and personal worlds were about to collide in ways I hadn't anticipated. "She's really impressive," Derek told me, his voice full of admiration. "She's been telling me about all these major campaigns she's working on, and she understands business in a way that most people don't. I think you'd really like her, Mel. You should meet her sometime." I agreed to meet Victoria, curious to see how she would interact with me in a social setting versus our workplace dynamic. Derek arranged a dinner at a trendy restaurant in downtown Phoenix, and I found myself in the strange position of preparing for a date with my brother and his girlfriend, who had no idea that the woman she considered just an assistant was actually conducting due diligence on her entire company. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The dinner was exactly as awkward as I had expected, but not in the ways I had anticipated. Victoria was charming and engaging with Derek, clearly making an effort to be the perfect girlfriend. She asked thoughtful questions about his work, laughed at his jokes, and demonstrated genuine interest in his hobbies and aspirations. But when Derek introduced me as his sister, who works in an office downtown, Victoria's demeanor subtly shifted. She was still polite and friendly, but there was a noticeable change in how she engaged with me. Her questions were simpler, her tone slightly more patronizing, and she had a way of steering conversations away from topics she apparently felt I wouldn't understand. "What kind of work do you do?" she asked, and when I told her I was an executive assistant, I could see her mentally categorizing me as someone whose opinions on professional matters wouldn't be particularly valuable. The conversation that would later become the centerpiece of my revenge was actually quite brief and seemed insignificant at the time. We were discussing Derek's latest project at work, and Victoria began explaining some marketing concepts that she thought might be relevant to software development. "It's all about understanding your target demographic and creating messaging that resonates with their pain points," she said, using the kind of confident tone that suggested she was sharing insider knowledge. "Most people don't really understand how sophisticated modern marketing has become." I made some basic comments about branding and customer engagement, drawing on knowledge I had gained from running my own companies but presenting it as casual observations rather than professional expertise. Victoria listened politely but then smiled in a way that was clearly meant to be encouraging rather than impressed. "You're really sweet, Melody," she said, "but marketing is quite a bit more complex than it seems from the outside. There's a lot of education and experience that goes into understanding these strategies. It's not something you just pick up from watching commercials or reading articles." Derek looked uncomfortable with his girlfriend's condescending tone, but he didn't say anything. I simply nodded and changed the subject, filing away this interaction as another data point about Victoria's personality and worldview. Over the next few weeks, Derek began bringing Victoria to family gatherings, and I had multiple opportunities to observe how she interacted with people she perceived as having different social or educational status. With Derek's engineering colleagues, she was respectful and interested. With my parents, who were both retired university professors, she was different and eager to impress. But with service workers, administrative staff, and anyone she perceived as having, quote, lower-level jobs, Victoria consistently displayed a subtle but unmistakable condescension. She wasn't overtly rude, but she had a way of making it clear that she viewed herself as fundamentally different from and superior to people who worked in support roles. This pattern became particularly evident at Derek's birthday party, which was held at my parents' house in Scottsdale. Victoria spent most of the evening networking with Derek's professional friends, discussing industry trends and career advancement strategies. But when Derek's longtime friend Marcus, who worked as a restaurant manager, tried to join the conversation, Victoria quickly steered the discussion toward topics that effectively excluded him. "Oh, you work in hospitality," she said when Marcus mentioned his job. "That must be interesting. Very different from what we do in the corporate world." The dismissive tone and the clear implication that restaurant management wasn't real professional work was subtle enough that most people wouldn't have noticed it. But I was watching Victoria carefully, trying to understand how she viewed people and work, and the pattern was becoming quite clear. It was during this party that Victoria made a comment that would later prove to be prophetic in ways she never could have imagined. "I just think it's important to surround yourself with people who challenge you intellectually," she told a group of Derek's friends. "I mean, it's nice to be friendly with everyone, but when you're talking about career growth and professional development, you need to focus on relationships with people who can actually contribute to those conversations." She glanced around the room as she said this, and her eyes briefly met mine before moving on, as if she was mentally categorizing me as someone who wouldn't be able to contribute to serious professional discussions. At that moment, I made a decision that would change both of our lives in ways neither of us could have predicted. I decided to accelerate my timeline for acquiring Pinnacle Marketing Solutions, and I decided that Victoria Hartwell would be the perfect case study for how assumptions about intelligence and capability can blind people to the truth that's right in front of them. The next Monday morning, I walked into the Pinnacle offices carrying the same leather portfolio I had carried every day for 2 months. But now it contained more than just administrative schedules and meeting notes. Hidden beneath the routine paperwork were detailed financial projections, acquisition strategies, and a preliminary offer that would make me the new owner of the company, where I was currently considered just a secretary. Victoria greeted me that morning with her usual pleasant but slightly patronizing smile, having no idea that the woman she had dismissed as intellectually inferior was about to become her boss. The woman she had suggested shouldn't participate in serious business conversations was about to own the company where those conversations took place. The irony was delicious, but I knew that the real satisfaction would come not from the reveal itself, but from what I could accomplish once I was in a position to demonstrate that intelligence, creativity, and business acumen exist at every level of an organization, if you're wise enough to recognize and nurture them. As I settled into my desk that morning, answering phones and scheduling meetings, while secretly preparing to purchase the entire company, I couldn't help but smile at the thought of Victoria's face when she learned the truth. But first, I had work to do. Both the administrative tasks that kept the office running and the strategic planning that would soon transform everything about how Pinnacle Marketing Solutions operated. The countdown to the most satisfying business meeting of my life had officially begun. The acquisition paperwork sat in my bedroom safe, complete, and ready for submission, while I continued my daily charade of being Pinnacle Marketing Solutions' most unassuming employee. 3 weeks had passed since Derek's birthday party, and Victoria had settled into a routine of treating me like a friendly but intellectually limited family acquaintance at social gatherings, and a competent but unremarkable administrative assistant at work. What she didn't realize was that her behavior was providing me with invaluable research data about toxic workplace dynamics and the hidden costs of hierarchical thinking in corporate environments. Every condescending comment, every assumption about my capabilities, every instance where she dismissed my potential contributions, was being cataloged and analyzed as part of what would soon become a comprehensive restructuring of the company's culture. The first major incident occurred during our 3rd week of what I privately called Phase 2 of my corporate anthropology experiment. Victoria had been assigned to lead the campaign for Westfield Technologies, a mid-sized software company that was looking to rebrand their entire corporate image. It was exactly the kind of high-profile project that could establish Pinnacle as a serious player in the Phoenix marketing scene, but it was also complex enough to require input from multiple departments and creative thinking from every level of the organization. I had been tasked with coordinating the project logistics, which meant I was present for most of the planning meetings and had access to all the client communications. From my position at the conference room table, taking notes and managing schedules, I watched Victoria struggle with several strategic challenges that I could have solved immediately, if anyone had thought to ask for my opinion. The client wanted to maintain their reputation for technical excellence, while appealing to a broader, less technically sophisticated customer base. Victoria's initial approach was to create 2 separate marketing tracks, one for tech-savvy buyers and another for general business users. It was a reasonable strategy, but it was also expensive, potentially confusing, and likely to dilute the brand rather than strengthen it. During the second planning meeting, as Victoria outlined her dual-track approach to the team, I found myself mentally redesigning the entire campaign. Instead of separating technical and general audiences, the solution was to create a unified narrative that positioned complex technology as accessible empowerment. Lead with the results and benefits that everyone could understand, then provide deeper technical details for those who wanted them. One brand voice, multiple entry points, consistent messaging. It was the kind of insight that comes from having actually built and marketed technology products to diverse audiences, but from Victoria's perspective, the woman taking notes in the corner couldn't possibly have relevant experience with enterprise software marketing. I tested my theory during a brief moment when Victoria stepped out to take a client call. Marcus Thompson, the financial director, was expressing concerns about the budget implications of running parallel campaigns, and Janet Rodriguez was wondering aloud whether there might be a simpler approach. "What if we focused on transformation stories instead of features?" I suggested casually, as if the idea had just occurred to me. Like, show how technology changes people's work lives rather than explaining what it does technically. That way, technical buyers see the capability and general buyers see the benefits. Janet looked intrigued, and Marcus nodded thoughtfully. But when Victoria returned to the meeting, she quickly reasserted control of the conversation without acknowledging that any alternative ideas had been discussed in her absence. The moment was a perfect microcosm of how hierarchical thinking stifles innovation. Good ideas go unrecognized and unimplemented because they come from the wrong source. Over the following days, I watched Victoria's campaign development process with growing fascination and frustration. She was clearly talented and hardworking, but she was also trapped by her own assumptions about where good ideas could come from. When junior team members suggested modifications to her strategy, she listened politely but rarely incorporated their feedback. When support staff like myself made observations about practical implementation challenges, she dismissed them as operational details that didn't affect the core strategy. The pattern became particularly evident during the creative development phase. Victoria had hired an expensive external design agency to create the visual elements of the campaign, but the designs they produced were sophisticated and beautiful in ways that completely missed the client's actual needs. The color palette was too muted for a technology company trying to project innovation. The typography was elegant but difficult to read in digital formats. The overall aesthetic was more appropriate for a luxury lifestyle brand than a software company. I knew this because I had spent 3 years working with designers and developers to create marketing materials for my own companies. I understood the difference between visual impact and practical effectiveness, between artistic beauty and commercial success. But pointing out these issues would require explaining knowledge that Melody Chen, executive assistant, wasn't supposed to possess. The solution came during a conversation with Amy Sullivan, one of the junior graphic designers who worked directly under Victoria's supervision. Amy was 24, recently graduated from art school, and clearly frustrated with the disconnect between what she was being asked to create and what she knew would actually work for the client. "I keep thinking the fonts are too fancy for a tech company," Amy confided during a coffee break conversation. "And those colors look great in print, but they're going to be terrible on screens. But Victoria loves the sophisticated look, and she says the client will appreciate the elegance." I had learned that the most effective way to influence decisions without overstepping my supposed role was to ask questions rather than make statements. "Have you seen how their current customers actually use their software?" I asked. "Like, are they looking at it on phones, tablets, big monitors? That might affect what colors and fonts work best." Amy's eyes lit up as she realized I was giving her a framework for providing feedback that Victoria would have to take seriously. Over the next few days, Amy conducted informal research into Westfield Technologies' user base and presented Victoria with data showing that the majority of their customers access the software through mobile devices and web interfaces, where the proposed design elements would be problematic. Victoria was impressed with Amy's initiative and agreed to request revisions from the design agency. The final campaign was significantly more effective because Amy had been empowered to contribute strategic thinking rather than just execution skills. But Victoria never realized that the insight had originated from a conversation with the executive assistant she considered incapable of understanding marketing strategy. This pattern repeated itself throughout the project. I would identify problems or opportunities, find ways to share those insights with team members who had the credibility to present them, and watch as solutions emerged that were attributed to Victoria's excellent leadership and team development skills. It was simultaneously frustrating and educational. I was learning firsthand how much organizational intelligence gets wasted when leaders make assumptions about their employees' capabilities. The Westfield campaign was ultimately successful, generating significant positive attention for Pinnacle and establishing Victoria as the company's rising star. At the celebration dinner that followed the campaign launch, I watched her accept congratulations and praise for leading what everyone agreed was the most innovative and effective marketing campaign in the company's history. "Victoria really knows how to bring out the best in her team," Robert Chen commented to the assembled group. "The collaboration and creative thinking that went into this project shows exactly the kind of leadership we need more of around here." Victoria beamed with pride and made gracious comments about the contributions of her team members. But her praise was carefully distributed according to the office hierarchy. Plenty of recognition for Marcus Thompson's budget management, generous acknowledgement of the external design agency's creativity, and thoughtful appreciation for Amy Sullivan's research initiative. The support staff who had coordinated logistics, managed communications, and provided practical insights remained invisible in her narrative of success. It was during this celebration that Victoria made a comment that crystallized my understanding of both her potential and her limitations as a leader. Someone asked her about her approach to team management, and she responded with obvious sincerity and conviction. "I think the key is recognizing people's strengths and putting them in positions where they can contribute most effectively," she said. "Everyone has something valuable to offer, but you have to understand what that is and create the right opportunities for them to shine." The irony was breathtaking. Victoria genuinely believed she was good at recognizing and developing talent, but she was blind to capabilities that didn't fit her preconceptions about how intelligence and creativity were distributed in the workplace. She could see Amy's potential because Amy had formal design education and an official role in the creative department. She couldn't see my potential because I was just an administrative assistant who couldn't possibly understand marketing strategy. This dynamic became even more pronounced in my interactions with Victoria outside the office. As her relationship with Derek deepened, I found myself included in more social gatherings, where the professional and personal sides of her personality blended in fascinating ways. Derek was clearly proud of his successful girlfriend, and he often mentioned her work accomplishments when introducing her to his friends and family. Victoria seemed to enjoy being seen as the ambitious, accomplished partner, and she had developed a polished way of discussing her career that highlighted her expertise while remaining appropriately modest. But I began to notice how differently she talked about work depending on her audience. With Derek's engineering colleagues, she emphasized the technical complexity and data-driven aspects of marketing strategy. With my parents, she focused on the creative and psychological elements of brand development. With Derek's friends who worked in finance, she discussed ROI metrics and budget optimization. It wasn't that she was being dishonest, she genuinely understood all these aspects of marketing. But she had an uncanny ability to sense what would impress each particular audience and to present herself accordingly. It was a sophisticated form of social intelligence that served her well professionally, but also revealed something calculating about how she approached relationships. The most telling example occurred during a dinner party at my parents' house, where Victoria found herself in conversation with Dr. Patricia Williams, a family friend who taught organizational psychology at Arizona State University. Dr. Williams was discussing her research into workplace dynamics and the hidden factors that affect team performance. "One of the most interesting findings in our recent studies," Dr. Williams explained, "is how often the most valuable insights come from people whose roles don't traditionally include strategic thinking. Administrative staff, customer service representatives, entry-level employees, they often have perspectives that senior leadership completely misses." Victoria nodded thoughtfully and made all the right comments about the importance of inclusive leadership and diverse perspectives. But later that evening, when Dr. Williams mentioned that she was looking for companies to participate in a research study about organizational intelligence, Victoria immediately volunteered Pinnacle as a potential case study. "We're really focused on creating a culture where everyone's contributions are valued," Victoria told her. "I'd love to have our practices evaluated by someone with your expertise." I nearly choked on my wine as I listened to Victoria describe Pinnacle's supposedly inclusive culture. The woman who regularly dismissed input from support staff and made assumptions about people's capabilities based on their job titles was presenting herself as a champion of organizational democracy. But as I thought about it more, I realized that Victoria wasn't being deliberately hypocritical. She genuinely believed that she valued diverse perspectives and inclusive leadership. The problem was that her definition of valuable insights and strategic thinking was limited by her assumptions about where intelligence and creativity could be found. This became even clearer during a conversation we had at Derek's apartment the following weekend. Victoria was preparing for a presentation to potential new clients, and she was practicing her pitch about Pinnacle's collaborative approach to marketing strategy. "The key to successful campaigns is leveraging the collective intelligence of the entire team," she explained to Derek and me as we helped her rehearse. "Every person brings unique insights and perspectives that can enhance the creative process." "That sounds really inclusive," Derek commented. "Do you actually get input from everyone, like admin staff and support people?" Victoria paused, looking slightly puzzled by the question. "Well, everyone contributes in their own way," she said. "Administrative staff handle the logistics that keep projects running smoothly. Junior team members learn by observing and assisting. Senior staff provide strategic guidance. It's about understanding everyone's role and making sure they can excel in their area of expertise." The response was revealing because it showed how Victoria had constructed a narrative of inclusion that actually reinforced traditional hierarchies. In her mind, valuing people's contributions meant ensuring they were good at the roles she had assigned them, not recognizing that those roles might be artificially limiting their potential impact. I decided to test this theory with a more direct approach. "What if someone in an administrative role had ideas about strategy?" I asked casually. "Like if they noticed something about client communications or market trends from their position?" Victoria smiled indulgently, the same expression she used when explaining complex concepts to people she assumed wouldn't understand them. "It's great when support staff are engaged and observant," she said, "and sometimes they do notice practical details that are helpful for implementation. But strategic thinking requires a different type of training and experience. It's not something you can just pick up from being around business conversations." Derek looked uncomfortable with his girlfriend's condescending tone, but he didn't challenge her directly. I simply nodded and changed the subject, adding another data point to my growing understanding of how Victoria's worldview shaped her leadership style. The conversation was particularly ironic because, unbeknownst to Victoria, I had spent that morning reviewing financial projections for 3 companies I was considering acquiring after Pinnacle. My administrative position was actually providing me with perfect cover for conducting due diligence on multiple investment opportunities while learning about organizational dynamics from an insider's perspective. But the most significant development during this period wasn't Victoria's continued condescension or my growing collection of examples demonstrating toxic workplace hierarchies. It was the gradual realization that my experiment was revealing problems that went far beyond one person's prejudices about intelligence and capability. Pinnacle Marketing Solutions was systematically wasting human resources because its culture discouraged input from anyone who didn't fit narrow definitions of expertise and authority. Good ideas were regularly overlooked because they came from the wrong people. Creative solutions went unimplemented because they weren't presented through proper channels. Employee engagement was low because people felt their contributions weren't valued beyond their specific job descriptions. Victoria wasn't the cause of these problems. She was a product of them. Her assumptions about intelligence and leadership reflected broader cultural patterns that existed throughout the organization and, I was beginning to suspect, throughout much of the corporate world. This realization transformed what had started as a personal experiment into something much more significant. I wasn't just planning to acquire a marketing company and reveal my identity to someone who had underestimated me. I was positioning myself to test whether alternative approaches to organizational leadership could produce better results for both the business and its employees. The stakes were about to get much higher, and the lessons much more valuable than I had originally anticipated. But first, I had to navigate the increasingly complex social dynamics that were developing, as Victoria became more entrenched in both my professional and personal worlds. The next phase of my experiment would test not just Victoria's assumptions about intelligence and capability, but also her capacity for growth when confronted with evidence that challenged her fundamental beliefs about how talent and leadership work in the modern economy. The results would surprise both of us, in ways neither of us could have predicted. The corporate retreat invitation arrived on a Thursday morning in early October, printed on expensive cardstock and personally signed by Robert Chen. Annual strategic planning weekend at Desert Winds Resort, leadership team and select staff. I stared at the invitation, realizing that Victoria had somehow managed to get me included in what was traditionally a management-only event. "I thought it would be good for you to see how high-level business planning works," Victoria explained when I thanked her for the inclusion. "You'll mainly be there to handle logistics and take notes, but it might help you understand what real strategic thinking looks like. Consider it a learning opportunity." The patronizing tone was familiar by now, but what Victoria didn't realize was that she had just given me unprecedented access to Pinnacle's complete leadership team during an intensive 3-day session where guards would be down and true opinions would be expressed. For someone planning a corporate acquisition, it was like being handed the keys to the executive suite. The retreat was scheduled for the first weekend in November at a luxury resort in Sedona, 2 hours north of Phoenix. 23 people would attend, including all department heads, senior staff, and what Robert Chen called emerging talent, junior employees who showed leadership potential. I was listed in a separate category, administrative support. I spent the weeks leading up to the retreat carefully observing the office dynamics and noting how different people prepared for what everyone agreed would be a crucial planning session. Pinnacle was at a crossroads. Robert's health issues were becoming more pronounced, and there were rumors that he was considering retirement or selling the company. The strategic decisions made during this retreat would determine the company's direction for the next several years. Victoria threw herself into retreat preparation with characteristic intensity. She scheduled multiple pre-meetings with her team, created detailed presentation materials, and rehearsed her contributions to what she clearly saw as her opportunity to establish herself as Robert's natural successor. Her confidence was impressive, but it was also based on assumptions about the company's problems and opportunities that were fundamentally flawed. From my administrative perch, I had access to client feedback, employee satisfaction surveys, and financial data that painted a different picture than what the leadership team was seeing. Pinnacle's biggest problems weren't strategic or creative. They were cultural and operational. Client retention was declining not because of poor campaign quality, but because account management was inconsistent. Employee turnover was increasing not because of compensation issues, but because talented people felt undervalued and excluded from decision-making processes. Most significantly, the company was missing major opportunities because its hierarchical structure prevented good ideas from reaching decision-makers. I had personally witnessed dozens of valuable insights from junior staff and support personnel that never made it into strategic discussions because they weren't presented through proper channels or by people with appropriate credentials. Kai Isburwitha Ben Distrup. 3 days before the retreat, I had a conversation with Amy Sullivan that crystallized my understanding of how deeply these problems ran throughout the organization. Amy had been working on an analysis of social media trends that could revolutionize how Pinnacle approached digital marketing, but she was struggling with how to present her findings to senior leadership. "I know this could save our clients thousands of dollars and improve their engagement rates," Amy explained, showing me charts and data that demonstrated sophisticated analytical thinking. "But I'm just a junior designer. Victoria and the other directors are going to want to know where I got the authority to analyze strategy instead of just creating graphics." The frustration in Amy's voice was heartbreaking because her analysis was genuinely brilliant. She had identified patterns in consumer behavior that the senior team was completely missing, and her recommendations could give Pinnacle a significant competitive advantage. But the company's culture had taught her to doubt her own expertise and to assume that strategic thinking was the exclusive domain of people with management titles. I spent an hour helping Amy refine her presentation and coaching her on how to frame her insights in language that would resonate with senior leadership. But I also realized that Amy's situation was symptomatic of a much larger problem that would need to be addressed systematically once I took control of the company. The retreat itself began on Friday evening with a cocktail reception that revealed the social dynamics of Pinnacle's leadership team in ways that regular office interactions never could. Away from the formal structure of meetings and presentations, people relaxed and expressed opinions they normally kept private. I circulated through the reception carrying my ever-present notebook, supposedly taking notes about logistics and schedules, but actually documenting conversations that provided invaluable intelligence about the company's internal politics and hidden conflicts. Victoria was in her element, networking effortlessly between different groups and positioning herself as the bridge between various factions within the leadership team. She had clearly studied the resort attendees and identified key influencers, whose support would be crucial for her advancement. Watching her work the room was like observing a masterclass in corporate social dynamics. But I also noticed something that Victoria herself seemed oblivious to. Several junior staff members were having much more substantive conversations about the company's challenges and opportunities than the official leadership discussions happening around the bar. These were the people who interacted with clients daily, who understood operational inefficiencies firsthand, who had ideas about innovation that could transform the business. The contrast was stark. While Victoria and her peers discussed abstract strategic concepts and industry trends, the junior staff were identifying specific, actionable solutions to problems that were directly affecting the company's performance and profitability. Saturday morning brought the first formal session, Pinnacle's position in the evolving marketing landscape. Victoria delivered the opening presentation, a polished overview of industry trends and competitive analysis that demonstrated her thorough research and sophisticated understanding of market dynamics. Her presentation was professionally impressive, but it was also based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what clients actually wanted from marketing services. Victoria was focused on cutting-edge techniques and innovative approaches that would establish Pinnacle as a thought leader. What she was missing, and what I could see clearly from my administrative position, was that most clients were struggling with basic implementation of proven strategies. They didn't need revolutionary new approaches. They needed reliable execution of fundamentals. They weren't looking for the most creative campaigns. They were looking for measurable results that justified their marketing budgets. Victoria's strategic vision was sophisticated, but disconnected from practical client needs. This disconnect became even more apparent during the breakout sessions that followed. I was assigned to rotate between different groups, ostensibly to provide logistical support, but actually giving me access to discussions happening at every level of the organization. The senior leadership group, led by Victoria and Marcus Thompson, spent 2 hours debating whether Pinnacle should specialize in emerging technologies or maintain its broad service approach. Their conversation was intellectually stimulating but completely theoretical. They were making strategic decisions without input from the people who actually delivered services to clients. Meanwhile, the client services team was having detailed discussions about specific improvements that could immediately enhance customer satisfaction and retention. Account managers had identified communication gaps that were causing project delays. Project coordinators had developed solutions for budget tracking that could improve profitability. Customer service representatives had collected feedback that revealed unmet client needs. None of this practical intelligence was being integrated into the strategic planning process because the company's structure assumed that operational staff implemented strategies rather than contributed to developing them. The most revealing moment came during Saturday afternoon's innovation workshop, where all attendees were supposed to brainstorm creative solutions to the company's biggest challenges. The session was facilitated by an expensive external consultant who used elaborate exercises and sophisticated frameworks to encourage, quote, outside-the-box thinking. After 2 hours of structured creativity exercises, the official results were disappointingly generic: improve client communication, develop new service offerings, invest in employee training. These were perfectly reasonable recommendations, But they were also obvious solutions that could have been generated without expensive facilitation or resort retreats. But during the coffee break that followed, I overheard a conversation between 3 junior staff members that contained more practical innovation than the entire official session. They had identified specific technology solutions that could automate routine tasks, freeing up senior staff for strategic work. They had developed ideas for client feedback systems that could prevent problems before they became crises. They had even outlined a mentorship program that could accelerate professional development while improving knowledge transfer throughout the organization. These weren't pie-in-the-sky concepts. They were detailed, actionable plans that could be implemented immediately with minimal investment. But because the ideas came from junior staff during an unofficial conversation, they would never be considered as part of the company's strategic direction. The irony was devastating. Pinnacle was spending thousands of dollars on external consultants and leadership retreats to generate innovation that was already flowing freely from employees whose insights were systematically ignored by the formal planning process. Saturday evening brought the retreat's social highlight, an elegant dinner followed by informal networking that was supposed to build relationships and encourage collaboration across departmental boundaries. I found myself in the fascinating position of observing how different groups interacted when the official hierarchy was temporarily relaxed. Victoria was clearly enjoying herself, engaging in animated conversations about industry trends and career development strategies. She had positioned herself at a table with Robert Chen and the other senior directors, and she was contributing to discussions about the company's future with obvious expertise and genuine passion. But I also noticed that Victoria's relaxed, collaborative demeanor was primarily reserved for people she considered peers or superiors. When junior staff approached her with questions or comments, she was polite but noticeably less engaged. She had mastered the art of appearing inclusive while maintaining clear boundaries about whose opinions actually mattered. The most telling interaction occurred when Jamie Martinez, a talented account coordinator, tried to share some client feedback that could influence strategic planning decisions. Victoria listened politely but then redirected the conversation toward more general topics, effectively dismissing Jamie's input without appearing rude or dismissive. "That's interesting feedback," Victoria said with a smile. "You should definitely share that with your supervisor so it can be incorporated into our regular client review process." Jamie walked away looking discouraged, and I realized that she had just experienced a masterclass in hierarchical deflection. Victoria had managed to acknowledge the input while ensuring it would never reach strategic decision-makers, all while maintaining the appearance of being supportive and engaged. Sunday morning brought the retreat's climax, final presentations, where each department would present their strategic recommendations for the coming year. Victoria had been chosen to deliver the concluding presentation that would synthesize all the weekend's discussions into a coherent vision for Pinnacle's future. Her presentation was exceptional. She had absorbed input from multiple sessions, identified common themes, and created a compelling narrative about how Pinnacle could position itself for growth in an increasingly competitive market. Her recommendations were sophisticated, well-researched, and professionally presented. But sitting in the back of the conference room with my notebook, I could see exactly what was missing from Victoria's strategic vision. All the practical insights from junior staff, all the client feedback from account managers, all the operational improvements suggested by support personnel, none of it had been integrated into the official strategic plan. Victoria's presentation was based entirely on input from senior leadership and external research. It was strategically sound but operationally naive, innovative but disconnected from practical implementation challenges. It was exactly the kind of top-down planning that looked impressive in conference rooms but failed in real-world application. The applause that followed Victoria's presentation was enthusiastic and genuine. Robert Chen praised her synthesis skills and strategic thinking. The other directors complimented her thorough research and compelling vision. Everyone agreed that the retreat had been successful, and that Pinnacle was well-positioned for the challenges ahead. But I knew something that no one else in that room understood. The strategic plan they were so excited about was doomed to fail because it ignored half the intelligence available within their own organization. As we packed up to return to Phoenix, I realized that the retreat had provided me with everything I needed to justify my acquisition of Pinnacle Marketing Solutions. I now had detailed documentation of the company's cultural problems, clear evidence of wasted human resources, and specific examples of how hierarchical thinking was limiting organizational performance. More importantly, I had identified the people who could help transform the company once I revealed my true identity and implemented new leadership approaches. Amy Sullivan, Jamie Martinez, and dozens of other talented employees were ready to contribute strategic thinking if they were given the opportunity and encouragement. The ride back to Phoenix was filled with excited conversation about the weekend's accomplishments and the strategic direction that had emerged from the planning sessions. Victoria was particularly animated, clearly feeling that she had established herself as a visionary leader whose insights would guide the company's future. "I think we really achieved something significant this weekend," she told Derek during a phone call from the resort shuttle. "The strategic framework we developed is going to position Pinnacle for major growth over the next 3 years." Listening to her confidence and enthusiasm, I felt an unexpected mixture of admiration and sadness. Victoria was genuinely talented and clearly cared about the company's success. But she was also trapped by assumptions about intelligence and leadership that prevented her from seeing the resources that surrounded her. In less than 2 weeks, I would reveal my true identity and begin implementing changes that would challenge everything Victoria believed about how successful organizations operated. The question wasn't whether she would be shocked by the revelation. That was inevitable. The question was whether she would be capable of adapting to a leadership model that valued insights based on their merit rather than their source. The answer would determine not just Victoria's future at Pinnacle, but also whether my experiment in organizational democracy could succeed in the competitive world of corporate marketing. The stakes were about to become very real for everyone involved. The morning of November 15th began like any other Tuesday at Pinnacle Marketing Solutions, but by noon it would become the day that changed everything for Victoria Hartwell and everyone else in the company. I arrived at the office carrying my usual leather portfolio, but hidden beneath the routine administrative paperwork were the final acquisition documents that would make me the new owner of the company within 48 hours. Robert Chen had agreed to the sale after 3 weeks of negotiations conducted through my attorney Sarah Goldman of Goldman Reeves & Associates. From Robert's perspective, he was selling to a mysterious but well-funded investment group called Chen Capital Holdings that had conducted extensive due diligence and presented a compelling vision for the company's future. He had no idea that the investment group was actually one person, the executive assistant who had been quietly observing his company's operations for 5 months. The final signatures were scheduled for Thursday morning, which meant I had exactly 2 days to navigate the most delicate phase of my experiment. The office was buzzing with rumors about potential changes and new ownership, but no one suspected that the person taking notes at staff meetings was actually orchestrating the entire transition. Victoria was particularly energized that morning, having received what she believed was excellent news about her career prospects. Robert had called her into his office the previous Friday to discuss, quote, leadership opportunities that would be opening up in the coming weeks. Victoria interpreted this as confirmation that she would be promoted to vice president once the company's ownership transition was complete. "I think Robert is finally ready to acknowledge that the company needs younger leadership with fresh ideas," she told Marcus Thompson during their morning coffee meeting, which I overheard while delivering quarterly reports to the accounting department. "This ownership change is probably exactly what we need to modernize operations and implement the strategic vision we developed at the retreat." What Victoria didn't know was that Robert's comments about leadership opportunities had been carefully orchestrated as part of my transition planning. I had specifically requested that he avoid making any commitments about personnel changes until after the acquisition was complete, but I had also asked him to maintain normal operations and avoid creating unnecessary anxiety among the staff. The irony was that Victoria was absolutely correct about the company needing younger leadership with fresh ideas. She just had no idea that the leadership change would come from a direction she never could have anticipated. The first sign that something extraordinary was happening came at 10:30 a.m., when Sarah Goldman arrived for what was announced as a routine legal consultation, but was actually our final pre-acquisition meeting. Sarah was an impressive woman in her 40s, who had built her practice by specializing in complex corporate transactions and employment law. She had been fascinated by my undercover approach to business acquisition and had become a valuable advisor for both the legal aspects and the psychological dynamics of what I was attempting. "Are you ready for this?" Sarah asked as we met briefly in the small conference room that I had reserved under the pretense of organizing files for Robert's meeting with potential investors. "I've been ready for months," I replied, reviewing the final paperwork that would transform me from Melody Chen Executive Assistant to Melody Chen Chief Executive Officer. "The question is whether everyone else is ready for what comes next." Sarah had advised me to handle the revelation carefully, recognizing that the psychological impact on employees could significantly affect the company's transition. We had developed a plan that would minimize shock while maximizing the educational value of what I had learned during my time undercover. The staff meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m., ostensibly to discuss important changes in company ownership and leadership structure. Robert had sent the meeting invitation that morning, and the response had been immediate and intense. Everyone knew that major announcements were coming, but the speculation about what those announcements might contain was wildly varied. Victoria spent most of the morning in strategic conversations with other senior staff members, clearly positioning herself as the natural liaison between the existing leadership team and whatever new ownership structure was about to be implemented. She was confident, prepared, and completely unprepared for what was actually going to happen. At 1:45 p.m., I made my way to the main conference room, carrying the same notebook and folder I had carried to hundreds of previous meetings. But this time, the folder contained a detailed presentation about organizational restructuring, employee empowerment initiatives, and the specific changes I planned to implement based on 5 months of observation and analysis. Victoria was already seated at the conference table, having positioned herself strategically next to Robert Chen and across from the empty chairs where the new ownership representatives were expected to sit. She looked professional and confident, clearly ready to make a strong first impression on the people who would determine her future with the company. The other attendees filed in with varying degrees of curiosity and anxiety. Marcus Thompson looked nervous but hopeful. Amy Sullivan and the other junior staff members seemed excited about the possibility of change. Janet Rodriguez appeared worried about how ownership changes might affect her role and responsibilities. The overall mood was tense but optimistic. Everyone agreed that Pinnacle needed fresh leadership and new direction. At exactly 2 p.m., Robert Chen stood up to address the assembled group. "Thank you all for being here on such short notice," he began, his voice carrying the mixture of excitement and nervousness that comes with major life transitions. "As most of you know, I've been considering retirement for some time, and I finally found the right buyer for Pinnacle Marketing Solutions." He paused, looking around the room at faces that reflected genuine affection and respect for his leadership over the past 12 years. "The new owner is someone who has demonstrated exceptional understanding of our company's operations, culture, and potential for growth. Someone who has shown genuine commitment to preserving what makes Pinnacle special, while implementing changes that will position us for future success." Victoria leaned forward slightly, clearly preparing to introduce herself to whoever was about to enter the conference room. Her expression was confident and welcoming, the perfect combination of respect for new leadership and confidence in her own value to the organization. "Ladies and gentlemen," Robert continued, "I'd like you to meet the new owner and Chief Executive Officer of Pinnacle Marketing Solutions." He gestured toward the front of the room, but instead of introducing someone who had just walked through the door, he was pointing directly at me. Melody Chen. The silence that followed was profound and electric. 22 pairs of eyes turned to stare at the woman who had been taking notes at their meetings for 5 months, trying to process information that didn't fit any framework they had for understanding corporate hierarchies or business acquisitions. Victoria's face went through a series of expressions that would have been comical if the situation weren't so charged with genuine emotion. Confusion gave way to disbelief, then to a dawning realization that everything she thought she knew about the past 5 months had been fundamentally wrong. "I don't understand," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. You're the executive assistant. How can you be the new owner?" I stood up slowly, setting down my notebook, and facing the group of colleagues who were seeing me clearly for the first time. "For the past 5 months, I've been working as your executive assistant while conducting what I suppose you could call an extended case study in organizational dynamics and workplace culture. I've been documenting how this company operates, identifying areas for improvement, and learning about business from a perspective I'd never experienced before. The room erupted in murmured conversations as people tried to process this information. Some faces showed amazement, others confusion, and a few displayed what looked like betrayal. But Victoria's expression was pure shock, as if her entire understanding of reality had been suddenly overturned. "You've been lying to us for 5 months?" she asked, her voice rising with indignation. "You've been pretending to be someone you're not, deceiving everyone in this company about your identity and your intentions?" The accusation hung in the air, and I could see that several other staff members were beginning to view my revelation through the same lens. From their perspective, I had indeed been dishonest about my background and qualifications, regardless of my motivations for doing so. "You're right that I wasn't completely honest about my background," I acknowledged, "and I understand that this revelation is shocking and probably feels manipulative. But I want to explain why I chose this approach, and what I learned that will benefit everyone in this room." Victoria wasn't ready to hear explanations. The woman who had spent months offering to help me understand real business thinking was now confronting the reality that she had been condescending to someone with significantly more business experience than herself. "This is unethical and probably illegal," she declared, standing up and addressing the room as if she were leading a resistance movement. "You can't just spy on employees and deceive people about your identity. There have to be laws against this kind of manipulation." Marcus Thompson looked confused and concerned. "Melody, or whoever you really are, this does seem like a pretty serious breach of trust. How do we know anything you're telling us now is true?" The questions and accusations were coming faster now, as people processed their shock and began to feel manipulated by someone they had trusted as a colleague. I could see that my revelation was creating exactly the kind of defensive reaction that Sarah Goldman had warned me about. "Let me address the legal and ethical concerns first," I said, pulling out documentation that Sarah had prepared for this exact situation. "Everything I've done has been completely legal. I applied for the executive assistant position under my real name, with accurate personal information, and I've performed all the duties of that role professionally and competently. The fact that I didn't mention my previous business experience wasn't dishonest. It was simply irrelevant to the job requirements." Victoria shook her head angrily. "Irrelevant? You've been pretending to be someone without business knowledge while secretly evaluating all of us. You've been listening to confidential conversations, accessing proprietary information, and making judgments about our performance while lying about your qualifications to do so." The room was becoming increasingly tense, with clear divisions emerging between people who were intrigued by my revelation and those who felt betrayed by what they saw as elaborate deception. Amy Sullivan looked fascinated but concerned. Janet Rodriguez seemed worried about job security. Several junior staff members appeared excited about the possibility that their new boss understood their perspectives and challenges. But Victoria was clearly feeling personally attacked, and her response was escalating in ways that revealed aspects of her personality that I hadn't seen before. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" she continued, her professional composure beginning to crack. "You think you've proved something by tricking us into treating you like a normal employee instead of a boss. But what you've actually done is shown that you're manipulative and dishonest. You're exactly the kind of person who shouldn't be trusted with leadership responsibilities." The personal attack was surprising in its intensity, but it was also revealing. Victoria was feeling humiliated by the realization that she had been condescending to someone who was actually more successful than herself, and she was expressing that humiliation as moral outrage about my methods. Victoria Robert Chen interjected, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. "I think we should let Melody explain her reasons before we make judgments about her ethics or qualifications." But Victoria was beyond listening to diplomatic suggestions. The woman who had built her professional identity around being the smartest, most sophisticated person in most rooms was now confronting evidence that her assumptions about intelligence and capability were fundamentally flawed. "You want to know what I think?" she said, addressing me directly with barely controlled anger. "I think you're a fraud who gets off on deceiving people and making them look stupid. I think you chose this company because you knew you could manipulate Robert into selling to you, based on information you gathered through lying and spying. The accusation was serious enough that several people in the room looked genuinely concerned about my motivations and methods. Victoria was effectively putting me on trial for deception and manipulation, using her credibility and speaking skills to frame my experiment as an elaborate con game. And furthermore, she continued, clearly building toward a dramatic conclusion, I think everyone in this room deserves to know exactly who they're really working for, and what kind of person makes decisions about their careers through deception and manipulation. She pulled out her phone, and I realized with a growing alarm that she was preparing to document our confrontation, possibly for legal purposes or public exposure. The woman who had spent months dismissing my intelligence was now positioning herself as the moral authority who would expose my supposed fraud to the world. Victoria, please put your phone away, Sarah Goldman said firmly, speaking for the first time since the meeting began. This is a private corporate meeting, and recording without consent would actually create legal issues that you probably don't want to deal with. But Victoria was beyond reasonable considerations about legal consequences or professional behavior. The humiliation of discovering that she had been wrong about someone's capabilities was being expressed as righteous indignation about ethics and honesty. I'm not going to let this fraud destroy this company or manipulate these people any further, she declared. Everyone deserves to know the truth about what's really been happening here. The confrontation had escalated far beyond what I had anticipated, even though Sarah and I had prepared for various scenarios involving employee resistance to my revelation. Victoria wasn't just questioning my methods. She was attacking my character and attempting to rally the other employees against accepting my leadership. What made the situation particularly ironic was that Victoria's response was demonstrating exactly the kind of rigid thinking and inability to adapt that I had observed throughout my time at Pinnacle. Instead of being curious about what I had learned or interested in how my insights might improve the company, she was focused entirely on defending her own ego and authority. The meeting that was supposed to herald a new era of inclusive leadership and organizational innovation was turning into a power struggle that would determine whether my experiment could succeed or whether the cultural problems I had identified were too deeply entrenched to overcome. As Victoria continued her accusations and the room grew more divided, I realized that the next few minutes would determine not just my future as Pinnacle's CEO, but also whether alternative approaches to leadership could survive confrontation with the traditional hierarchical thinking they were designed to replace. The real test of my experiment was about to begin. The tension in the conference room reached a breaking point as Victoria continued her accusations, but I knew that emotional confrontation wouldn't resolve the fundamental questions about my credibility and leadership qualifications. It was time to shift from defensive explanations to proactive demonstration of exactly who I was and what I brought to this company. Victoria, I understand your concerns about my methods, I said, maintaining a calm tone despite the charged atmosphere. Rather than continuing to debate the ethics of my approach, let me show everyone exactly what I learned during these 5 months, and why those insights will benefit every person in this room. I opened my portfolio and pulled out the comprehensive analysis I had prepared, 200 pages of detailed observations, strategic recommendations, and implementation plans based on my undercover experience. But more importantly, I had documentation that would prove my business credentials in ways that no amount of argument could refute. Sarah, would you please distribute the materials we prepared? I asked my attorney, who had been quietly observing the confrontation while taking notes for legal purposes. As Sarah handed out document packets to each attendee, I could see the mixture of curiosity and skepticism on their faces. Victoria crossed her arms defensively, clearly preparing to dismiss whatever evidence I was about to present. The first section contains verification of my business background, I explained. Tax returns, bank statements, and corporate filings that prove I've built and sold 2 successful technology companies over the past 6 years. You'll see acquisition agreements showing that my most recent company, Streamline Core, was purchased for $48 million by Dataflow Industries in March of this year. Marcus Thompson looked up from the documents with obvious surprise. These are real financial statements? You actually sold a company for $48 million? The documentation has been verified by independent accountants, Sarah confirmed. Ms. Chen's business credentials are genuine and substantial. Victoria was flipping through the financial records with growing agitation. The evidence was undeniable. The woman she had been treating as intellectually inferior had more business success and financial resources than anyone else in the room, including Robert Chen himself. "Money doesn't prove that you weren't deceptive," Victoria said, but her voice lacked the confident authority she had displayed earlier. "Rich people can still be manipulative and dishonest." "You're absolutely right," I agreed, which is why the second section contains detailed analysis of what I observed during my time here, including specific recommendations for improving company performance and employee satisfaction. I moved to the whiteboard at the front of the conference room and began outlining the key findings from my organizational study. Over 5 months, I documented 47 instances where valuable insights from junior staff or support personnel were dismissed or ignored by senior leadership. I recorded 23 occasions where client problems could have been prevented if information from account coordinators had reached decision-makers. I identified 15 operational inefficiencies that are costing this company approximately $180,000 annually in wasted time and resources. The room grew quiet as people realized I was presenting specific, measurable problems that they had all witnessed but never seen quantified or analyzed systematically. Amy Sullivan raised her hand tentatively. "Are you talking about things like my social media analysis that took 3 weeks to get reviewed?" "Exactly," I replied, turning to a fresh section of the whiteboard. Amy's research on consumer engagement patterns could have saved our clients $50,000 in advertising costs this quarter alone. But it took 3 weeks to reach strategic decision-makers, because our organizational structure assumes that insights flow upward through rigid hierarchical channels. I could see that several junior staff members were nodding in recognition, while senior leadership looked uncomfortable with the implications of what I was describing. Jamie Martinez, I continued, identified communication gaps in the Westfield Technologies account that were causing project delays and client frustration. Her recommendations could have prevented the budget overruns that occurred in September, but her insights were classified as, quote, operational details, rather than strategic intelligence. Jamie looked surprised that I had noticed and remembered her contributions. "I thought my supervisor would pass that information along to the project managers," she said. "And your supervisor probably thought someone else would handle it," I replied. "This isn't about individual failures. It's about systems that waste human intelligence because they're based on outdated assumptions about where good ideas come from." Victoria was studying the documentation I had provided, and I could see her trying to find flaws in my analysis or methodology. "These are just anecdotal observations," she said. "You can't make major organizational changes based on subjective impressions from someone who is pretending to be an entry-level employee." "You're right that anecdotal observations aren't sufficient for major decisions," I agreed. Which is why the third section contains comparative analysis with industry benchmarks, productivity metrics, and employee satisfaction data that supports my findings. I had spent weeks compiling data that demonstrated Pinnacle's performance, compared to similar companies with more inclusive organizational cultures. The results were striking. Companies that actively solicited input from all levels of staff showed 23% higher client retention, 31% better employee satisfaction scores, and 18% greater profitability than organizations with traditional hierarchical structures. Marcus Thompson was studying the comparative data with obvious interest. "These numbers are pretty compelling," he admitted, "but how do we know that changing our organizational structure would actually produce these results?" "Excellent question," I replied. "The fourth section outlines a phased implementation plan with specific metrics for measuring progress. We'll pilot new communication systems in one department, track results for 90 days, and expand successful initiatives based on documented improvements." I could see that the mood in the room was shifting as people processed evidence that challenged their assumptions about both my qualifications and their company's performance. But Victoria wasn't ready to concede defeat in what had become a battle for credibility and leadership authority. "This all sounds very impressive in theory," she said, "but you still haven't addressed the fundamental ethical problem with your methods. You deceived everyone in this company for months. You violated our trust and manipulated our relationships for your own purposes. How do we know you won't continue to be dishonest and manipulative as our boss?" The question struck at the heart of what this confrontation was really about. Victoria wasn't just defending her professional reputation. She was fighting for a worldview that equated formal credentials with intelligence, hierarchical position with leadership capability, and traditional authority structures with ethical behavior. Victoria, I understand why my methods feel deceptive, I said. But let me ask you a question. During these 5 months, did I ever lie to you about anything other than my business background? Did I ever manipulate situations for personal gain? Did I ever use information inappropriately or betray confidences? She paused, clearly trying to think of specific examples of unethical behavior beyond the fundamental deception about my credentials. You used your position to spy on confidential conversations, she said finally. I listened to conversations that occurred in my presence during normal business operations, I corrected. I never accessed confidential documents, recorded private communications, or sought information that wasn't freely shared in workplace settings. Sarah Goldman spoke up to provide legal context. Ms. Chen's activities have been reviewed by employment law specialists. She fulfilled all job requirements professionally, respected confidentiality agreements, and gathered information only through normal workplace interactions. Her methods were unconventional, but legally sound. But Victoria was still focused on the personal humiliation of having been wrong about someone's capabilities. You let me explain basic business concepts to you, she said, her voice tight with embarrassment. You sat there pretending not to understand things you probably knew better than I did. You made me look like a fool. The vulnerability in Victoria's voice revealed the real source of her anger. This wasn't about ethics or methodology. It was about pride and the painful realization that her assumptions about intelligence and capability had been fundamentally flawed. Victoria, I said gently, I never pretended not to understand business concepts. I asked questions because I was genuinely curious about your perspectives and insights. Your expertise in marketing strategy is real and valuable. That hasn't changed just because you learned something new about my background. But you were judging me the whole time, she replied. You were studying how I treated people and making notes about my leadership style. Yes, I was, I admitted, but I was also learning from your expertise and benefiting from your knowledge. The Westfield campaign succeeded partly because your strategic vision was excellent, even though some implementation challenges could have been avoided with better communication systems. I could see that several people in the room were beginning to understand the complexity of what I had been doing. This wasn't simply deception or manipulation. It was research that had generated valuable insights about organizational effectiveness while revealing uncomfortable truths about workplace hierarchies. Amy Sullivan spoke up hesitantly. Melody, when you helped me refine my social media presentation, were you testing me or actually trying to help? I was genuinely trying to help, I replied. Your analysis was brilliant, but you needed coaching on how to present it in ways that senior leadership would take seriously. The fact that you needed that coaching reveals problems with our communication systems, not with your capabilities. So you were already planning to buy the company when you helped me? Amy asked. Yes, but helping you succeed wasn't part of some manipulation strategy. Your success benefits the company, which benefits everyone. Good leadership means helping people reach their potential regardless of personal agendas. Janet Rodriguez had been quietly studying the documentation throughout the confrontation, and now she looked up with a thoughtful expression. Melody, these recommendations about operational efficiency, they're based on problems you saw while doing my job? Partly, I agreed. You've been managing administrative systems that could be significantly improved with better technology and communication processes. But you've also developed solutions that could benefit the entire company if they were implemented systematically. What kind of solutions? Janet asked. I turned to a fresh section of the whiteboard and began outlining specific recommendations that had emerged from my observations of Janet's work. Your client tracking system is more comprehensive than what the account managers use. Your scheduling protocols are more efficient than what the project coordinators follow. Your filing system contains information that could prevent communication gaps if it were accessible to relevant staff members. Janet looked surprised and pleased to see her contributions recognized and valued. I've been suggesting some of these improvements for years, but nobody thought they were important enough to implement. That's exactly the problem I'm trying to solve, I explained. This company has incredible human resources that aren't being fully utilized because our systems assume that innovation only comes from senior leadership. The room had grown quiet as people processed the implications of what I was describing. Even Victoria seemed to be listening more carefully, though her expression remained skeptical and defensive. Marcus Thompson broke the silence with a practical question. Melody, assuming we accept that your analysis is accurate and your intentions are genuine, what happens next? How do we transition from this confrontation to actually working together? Excellent question, I replied. The final section of your packets contains a 30-day transition plan that addresses both immediate operational needs and longer-term cultural changes. I outlined the key elements of my implementation strategy: immediate formation of cross-departmental communication teams, pilot programs for inclusive decision-making processes, technology upgrades to support better information sharing, and regular feedback sessions to monitor progress and address concerns. Most importantly, I continued, I'm proposing to maintain my current salary and benefits package for the first year while demonstrating that these changes actually improve company performance. If we don't see measurable improvements in client satisfaction, employee engagement, and profitability within 12 months, I'll step down and help transition leadership to someone the staff chooses. The offer was designed to address concerns about my motivations while creating accountability for the success of my leadership approach. But it also revealed something important about my confidence in the changes I was proposing. Victoria looked up from studying the transition plan with an expression that suggested grudging respect mixed with continued skepticism. You're really willing to risk your investment in this company on whether your theories about organizational democracy actually work? Yes, I replied simply, because I've seen what this company could accomplish if we removed the barriers that prevent good ideas from reaching implementation. The potential is extraordinary. We just need systems that recognize and nurture intelligence wherever it exists. The confrontation that had begun with accusations and defensive arguments was evolving into something more productive, a serious discussion about leadership, organizational effectiveness, and the possibility of creating a workplace culture that truly valued human potential. But I could see that Victoria was still struggling with the personal implications of everything that had been revealed. The woman who had built her professional identity around being the smartest, most qualified person in most rooms was now confronting evidence that her assumptions about intelligence and capability had been limiting her own effectiveness as a leader. The question that remained was whether she could adapt to new realities, or whether her need to maintain existing hierarchies would prevent her from embracing the changes that could benefit everyone, including herself. The answer would determine not just Victoria's future at Pinnacle, but also whether my experiment in inclusive leadership could succeed in the real world of corporate competition and workplace politics. The atmosphere in the conference room had shifted from hostile confrontation to tense negotiation, but I could see that Victoria was still struggling with the complete upheaval of everything she thought she knew about workplace dynamics and personal relationships. The evidence I had presented was undeniable, but accepting it meant acknowledging that her entire framework for understanding intelligence, capability, and professional worth had been fundamentally flawed. I need to make a phone call, Victoria announced suddenly, standing up and reaching for her purse. This is too much to process all at once. I need to talk to someone who can help me understand what's really happening here. Victoria, wait, I said, recognizing that this moment was crucial for both her personal development and the company's future. Before you make any calls, there's something else you need to know, something that will help you understand why this situation is more complex than just my business credentials or leadership methods. She paused, her hand on the conference room door, clearly torn between fleeing from an overwhelmingly uncomfortable situation and staying to hear information that might help her make sense of everything that had just been revealed. What could possibly make this situation more complex, she asked, her voice carrying a mixture of exhaustion and apprehension. I took a deep breath, knowing that what I was about to reveal would either help Victoria understand the true nature of our relationship or completely destroy any possibility of future collaboration. Hi, Aziz. Victoria, the person you were planning to call, is it Derek? Her face went pale as she realized that I knew exactly who she had been thinking of contacting. How did you? Of course you know about Derek. You've been analyzing all of us this whole time. Victoria, Derek is my brother. The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear the air conditioning system cycling on in the distance. Victoria's face went through a series of expressions as she processed information that recontextualized not just our professional relationship, but also months of personal interactions and family gatherings. "Your brother," she repeated slowly, as if testing whether the words made sense when spoken aloud. "Derek Chen is your brother. The Derek who's been talking about his sister Melody, who works in an office downtown." "Yes," I confirmed. "The same Derek who's been proud of his girlfriend's success at Pinnacle Marketing Solutions. The same Derek who's been hoping that his sister and his girlfriend would become friends." Victoria sank back into her chair, looking as if she had been physically struck. The implications were cascading through her mind. Every conversation we had shared at family gatherings, every condescending comment she had made about my supposed lack of business sophistication, every assumption she had expressed about my intellectual capabilities. "Oh my God," she whispered, "the barbecue, the dinner parties. All those times I explained marketing concepts to you like you were a child who needed simple explanations for complex ideas." "Yes," I said gently. "Including the conversation where you told me that marketing was, quote, quite a bit more complex than it seems from the outside, and that there was a lot of education and experience that goes into understanding these strategies." The room was so quiet that everyone could hear Victoria's sharp intake of breath as she remembered the specific moment I was referencing. Marcus Thompson looked confused about the personal dynamics that were suddenly being revealed, but Amy Sullivan and several other staff members seemed fascinated by this additional layer of complexity. "You've been watching me humiliate myself for months," Victoria said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every time I patronized you at family gatherings, every time I suggested you wouldn't understand adult business conversations, every time I treated you like you were intellectually inferior, you knew exactly how wrong I was." The weight of her realization was visible on her face, as she processed not just the professional implications, but the personal devastation of having so completely misjudged someone who was meant to become family. "Derek," she said suddenly, her voice breaking, "oh God, Derek, what must he think of me now? What must your whole family think of how I've been treating you?" I could see tears forming in her eyes as the full emotional impact hit her. This wasn't just about professional embarrassment anymore. It was about the painful realization that she had revealed fundamental character flaws to people whose respect and acceptance she desperately wanted. "Victoria," I said gently, "Derek has been concerned about some of your comments, but he loves you. He's been hoping that spending more time together would help you see that intelligence and capability exist in many different forms." "He's been hoping I would become a better person," she said bitterly. "He's been dating someone who judges people based on their job titles and educational credentials, and he's been hoping I would grow out of it." The vulnerability in her voice was heartbreaking. Victoria was confronting not just her professional prejudices, but the deeper personality traits that had shaped how she viewed herself and others. Marcus Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I feel like we're witnessing something very personal here. Maybe we should give Victoria some privacy to process this?" But Victoria shook her head firmly. "No, everyone in this room has seen how I've operated for the past 3 years. If I'm going to change, if this company is going to change, then we need to be honest about what's been wrong and how we're going to fix it." She stood up and walked to the front of the room, facing her colleagues with tears still visible in her eyes but her voice steady with determination. "I need to apologize," she began, "not just to Melody, but to everyone in this room. For 3 years I've been dismissing people's ideas and contributions because of assumptions I made about their education, their job titles, their backgrounds." She looked directly at Amy Sullivan. "Amy, your social media analysis was brilliant, and I delayed implementing it because I thought strategic thinking was my job, not yours." She turned to Jamie Martinez. "Jamie, you identified client communication problems that could have saved us thousands of dollars, and I ignored your insights because I assumed operational staff couldn't understand strategic implications." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "Janet, you've been managing systems and processes more efficiently than anyone in senior leadership, and I've never acknowledged your expertise because I thought administrative work was somehow less important than marketing strategy." The room was completely silent as Victoria made her way through personal apologies to nearly every staff member, acknowledging specific instances where her hierarchical thinking had wasted their talents and dismissed their contributions. Most importantly, she said, turning back to me, Melody, I treated you like you were intellectually inferior because I assumed that job titles reflected intelligence and capability. I was wrong about you, but more importantly, I was wrong about how intelligence and leadership actually work. She paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. I want to learn how to be different. I want to understand how to recognize and value people's contributions regardless of their formal positions. If you're willing to teach me, I'd like to stay and help implement these changes. The transformation in Victoria's demeanor was remarkable. The defensive, angry woman who had been accusing me of fraud and manipulation just an hour earlier had been replaced by someone who was genuinely committed to personal and professional growth. Victoria, I replied, I would be honored to work with you on implementing these changes. Your marketing expertise combined with a more inclusive leadership approach could make this company incredibly successful. Amy Sullivan raised her hand tentatively. Does this mean we're really going to implement the changes you outlined, the cross-departmental teams and the inclusive decision-making processes? Starting Monday morning, I confirmed. Amy, your social media analysis will be our first pilot project. Victoria will work with you to develop implementation strategies, but the insights and recommendations will come from your research. And will my efficiency improvements actually be considered? Janet asked hopefully. Janet, your improvements will be the foundation for our new operational systems, I replied. You understand workflow and communication better than anyone else in this company. Over the next hour, we worked through the practical details of implementing organizational changes that would transform Pinnacle from a traditional hierarchy into a collaborative workplace where good ideas were valued regardless of their source. Victoria threw herself into the planning process with the same intensity she had previously applied to defending traditional authority structures. But now her energy was focused on learning how to recognize and nurture talent at every level of the organization. I have so much to learn, she admitted as we outlined training programs that would help all staff members develop leadership and communication skills. I thought I understood management, but I was really just maintaining systems that wasted human potential. As the meeting concluded and people began filing out to return to their regular work, Victoria approached me with obvious nervousness about addressing our personal relationship. Melody, what do I say to Derek tonight? How do I explain that his girlfriend has been condescending to his sister for months without realizing who she was? Tell him the truth, I suggested. Tell him that you learned something important about yourself today, and that you're committed to becoming the kind of person who deserves his respect and his family's acceptance. What if he can't forgive me for how I treated you? She asked, her voice small and vulnerable. Derek has already forgiven you, I replied. He told me last week that he could see you were struggling with some prejudices, but he believed you were capable of growth. Today proved him right. 3 months later, Pinnacle Marketing Solutions had become a case study in successful organizational transformation. Client satisfaction had increased by 31%. Employee engagement scores had reached industry-leading levels, and profitability had improved by 23% as we eliminated the inefficiencies that came from hierarchical decision-making. Victoria had become one of the most effective collaborative leaders I had ever worked with, combining her sophisticated marketing expertise with genuine respect for insights from all organizational levels. The woman who had once dismissed administrative staff as intellectually limited was now mentoring junior employees and implementing innovations that originated from support personnel. Amy Sullivan's social media strategies had revolutionized our client services and earned her a promotion to Digital Strategy Director. Jamie Martinez had been promoted to Client Relations Manager after developing communication protocols that eliminated project delays and budget overruns. Janet Rodriguez had been named Operations Director, finally receiving official recognition for expertise she had been demonstrating for years. The most satisfying change was watching Victoria's relationship with Derek evolve as she became more self-aware and inclusive in her approach to other people. Their engagement announcement came 6 months after the acquisition, and Victoria's speech at the celebration dinner showed how profoundly she had changed. I used to think that intelligence and capability were rare qualities that could be easily identified through credentials and positions, she told the assembled friends and family. But I learned that I was surrounded by brilliant creative people whose potential I couldn't see because I was looking in the wrong places and making assumptions based on outdated ideas about how talent works. She looked at me across the room and smiled. My future sister-in-law taught me that real leadership means creating environments where everyone's contributions are valued and everyone's potential can be developed. It's the most important lesson I've ever learned, both professionally and personally. As I watched Victoria interact with our extended family, asking thoughtful questions and genuinely listening to people regardless of their backgrounds or occupations, I realized that my experiment had succeeded beyond my original expectations. I hadn't just acquired a company and exposed workplace hierarchies. I had helped someone discover that intelligence, creativity, and leadership capability exist everywhere if you're wise enough to recognize and nurture them. The greatest transformation wasn't in Pinnacle's organizational chart or profit margins. It was in Victoria's understanding that treating people with respect and recognizing their potential isn't just good business strategy. It's the foundation of all meaningful relationships, whether they're professional or personal. 6 months after that first shocking staff meeting, Derek and Victoria's wedding reception was held at Pinnacle's headquarters, now redesigned as an open, collaborative workspace, where good ideas flowed freely between departments and every employee understood that their insights were valued. During her maid of honor speech, I reflected on how this entire journey had taught me something unexpected about leadership and human potential. I had started this experiment thinking I was studying workplace dynamics and organizational efficiency. But I had discovered something much more important, that people are capable of extraordinary growth when they're given honest feedback, genuine support, and opportunities to contribute their best thinking. Victoria's transformation from condescending superior to inclusive leader wasn't just professionally beneficial, it was personally inspiring. It proved that even deeply ingrained prejudices could be overcome when people were willing to examine their assumptions and commit to becoming better versions of themselves. As I raised my glass to toast Derek and Victoria's marriage, I realized that the most successful acquisition I had ever made wasn't Pinnacle Marketing Solutions. It was gaining a sister-in-law who had learned to see and value the potential that exists in every person, regardless of their job title, educational background, or position in any hierarchy. The woman who had once dismissed me as just a secretary had become someone who understood that there's no such thing as just anything when it comes to human capability and potential. And that understanding had transformed not just her leadership style, but her capacity for building genuine relationships based on respect, curiosity, and recognition of the extraordinary talents that surround us every day. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.